Good morning and welcome, dear friends, to the CEC live lecture session. In today's session, we will be discussing the world literature in English stream, and today's topic is the novel Voss by Patrick White, who is an Australian author. In this series of world literature, we will be discussing the Australian experience in world literature. And to discuss this topic within studios with us, we have Dr. Anand Prakash. Dr. Anand Prakash is an eminent faculty of English literature. He is retired from DU. And let me remind you, friends, that regarding this ongoing session, if you have any queries or questions, you can call us on our toll-free number, that is 1800-110-430. So let's welcome Dr. Prakash to the studios. Welcome, sir. Please continue with the topic.
Thank you, Dr. Seema, and welcome viewers. And as has been announced by Dr. Seema, the discussion today will be on Patrick White's novel Voss, V-O-S-S. And it's an Australian novel, and Patrick White is an Australian author. And it's a little, consciously to be discussed that Australia did not have a history. It came into being as Australia as we know it in the 19th century, maybe a little before, when the colonial people descended there and started influencing the life in Australia. And when I say that it had no history, what I mean is that there were people in Australia who were the original inhabitants, and they were named Aborigines, who were originally there, but then they didn't have any say in the matter regarding organized life. So it was a kind of virgin island for the Europeans, where nobody lived. Of course, there were millions of people who lived, but then it was assumed, that the people who lived there did not exist. It's a very cruel statement to make, but it's a fact, and that is also, let's say, the tragedy of the Australian continent. This person, Patrick White, was born in England of the Australian parents in 1912, and this particular year is important because when he's 2 years, the First World War will begin in 1914. And when he is 37 years old, the Second World War will begin. And he is born in England, but then when he is 2 months old, he shifted to Australia. So the first 13 years of his life, he would be living in Australia. And when the World War begins, first one, then he doesn't know anything about it. But when the World War ends, that is in 1917, from that time onwards, as Patrick White would be 5 years, he would be listening to the tales and narratives of the First World War, and he'll grow up, knowing, understanding what happened in the First World War. Maybe there is some participation by the Australians also in the war. Australians lived in England; they got their education there, and they might have become soldiers. So when their families, would be told that somebody died or somebody, had this experience of violence in the First World War, then young Patrick White would know about it, second hand. He'll be aware of what happened in the First World War, and then he'll get his education, the first initial education in Australia. For 13 years he would be there, so he would be doing his schooling mostly, and then he shifted to England again. Where does he belong to? His parents are Australian. He is born in England. He is brought to Australia when he is 2 months old. He gets his primary education there, even the middle school examination, and then he shifted to England again. It's very difficult to belong to a place which is shifting, which is changing all the time. And in England, as he gets his schooling, his college, and the later education, which is higher education, then his ideas and his mind generally would be formed by the English influence. And what is the English influence, and what are the English ideas? This is for us to ponder over, to understand, to grasp. English experience, English ideas are totally different from and at variance with ideas that existed in Australia, but Australians didn't know about it, that they were English ideas. They would think that they were their ideas because education was imparted in the 20th century in Australia, also in the English medium, and the textbooks would be English. Now, regarding Australia's history, another important thing that is there, which is very, which also leaves an impact on the life of the people, is that initially it was supposed to be a kind of a place where it would be a kind of jail. Let's say that a large number of people who could not be accommodated in the English jails would be shifted to Australia, and they would be sentenced to death. They would not be sentenced to death, but life imprisonment, and for that reason, there will be a danger to the steady life of England back home. So they will be shifted there. It's a kind of Kalapani, so far as England is concerned. But then in the 19th century, something more happened. That was that people came to know that there was gold in Australia, and there were gold mines, and they could be used for digging out the material, raw material for making gold. And then that gold rush happened, and not just England, but many other countries of Europe, particularly Germany, they also rushed to Australia to take advantage of the gold mines. So initially the Englishmen are occupying the continent, and later when this gold rush happens, a large number of people from other nationalities in Europe, they also come to this place. So Australia belongs to whom? To England, to the European nations, and also to Aborigines? No, not to Aborigines. They would be pushed further into the forests. They would not have, as the Englishman would say, a language. They would have a dialect. They would be speaking with one another in that dialect, but the dialect is not understood by the Englishmen or by the Europeans. And sometime in the early 20th century or 19th century, among the prisoners, those who were educated, those who had some intellectual perception of life, they would start writing diaries. They would start creating documentary evidence for what was happening in Australia. They were English. They had direct contact with the Englishmen through post or whatever, and they wrote in English. They spoke English, and they spoke other languages. And in this atmosphere of the clashing of languages, clashing of cultures, Australia is going to grow up. So Australian literature means books written in English and in the form of literary form. It can be a short story, it can be a novel, it can be poetry. And this English literature would be Australian only in the sense that people who live in Australia will write it. But then they would have their heritage, they would have their traditional knowledge of English literature. For instance, in England, there is a very developed novel. There is also very developed poetry, the most developed dramatic form in the name of Shakespeare, that is there. So these people would have been well versed with what was written in England in English language. And when they wrote in English about their experience in Australia, then they would be observing most of the European or the English forms. So it is by proxy English literature. And Patrick White would struggle hard to come out of this conundrum, this dilemma, that when he is talking about the Australian experience, as Dr. Seema was pointing out, then that Australian experience is to be actually initially the English experience, the European experience, not the Australian experience. What do I mean by drawing a line between the English European experience and the Australian experience? What I do is that there would be ideas in Australia also. There would be difficulties peculiar to the Australian culture. And even though there was a conflict all the time, and these people initially who came to Australia were all criminals, and they were able-bodied, and they were violent people, and they would not brook any disagreement with anybody there. So they would fight among themselves, and they would also fight with the Aborigines of the Australians. In fact, there would be mass massacre in the 18th century and in the 19th century of the Aborigines, and they would not show their face. And this is the kind of violence, this is the kind of intolerance, this is the kind of division of society that young Patrick White would have to face when he comes to Australia very young, and when he spends his time there. So he has, for instance, English children to work with. He would have European children to work with, European teachers, English teachers, and he would be most of the textbooks will be English or European, and he would look at the Australian life, its sand, its rocks, its water, its nature, the presence of the Aborigines, and some kind of a talk between them. Maybe in the 20th century, some Aborigines who are left, they would be working in the homes of the English and the Europeans, and they would have some kind of a communication with each other. So all this, this Patrick White would be aware of at the unconscious level, at the subconscious level, and he would be absorbing these ideas and values there. So you would, for instance, know that there are superior people and there are inferior people. Superior are the whites, the inferior are the Australian inhabitants called Aborigines, and he would draw a line of distinction for some time. But then he would realize that the Aborigines also are human beings, and the weaker people even among whites are human beings, and women, who are all the time walked against and rejected, they also are human beings. So he would have a kind of conflicting interest in the Australian culture, and that will bring in some level of politics in him. Is England taking advantage of Australia? Are European nations taking advantage of Australia? Are they, for instance, using the Australian resources for being shifted from that place to Europe to be processed, and finished goods come back to Australia? Isn't that a kind of advantage that the European nations are taking of the Australian resources in the 20th century? That, and in England and Europe became industrialized hugely in the 19th century. So they had the industrial know-how, they had machines to work with, and Australia would not have a machinery of that kind. So raw materials from on the one side and the finished goods on the other. So you would see that economically speaking, there is a stage for exploitation. That it is your resources, that they are being bought cheap, they are being produced cheap, then they are shifted to the Western societies. There they are made into finished goods, then they are brought back. The pricing is in the hands of the sellers, and the buyers are supposed to buy whatever is available at whatever cost or price. So this is the kind of situation that is evolving in the 20th century. So what's going to happen to a person like Patrick White, who might be a descendant of a criminal family, but he is no criminal himself. He has got fairly good education. He is a liberal, and as a liberal, he would like to look at things differently. And finally, when this kind of economic social exploitation translates into political experience, then what side should Patrick White take? He'll come back after his education. He'll start living as a 25-year-old or so in Australia again, and he takes to writing. And writing involves imagining people. Writing doesn't mean simply writing biographies of people, but you start imagining characters in your novels. And if you take a strong character, you also take a weak character. You have to tell the audience that the strong character is strong for this reason, which means that there are weak people. And when he makes the two people talk, then he'll bring in the Australian reality. So that's how the writers also start taking part in a kind of education that they create themselves. And this is why he must be very greatly educated by himself through his writing, through his interaction with people, through his disagreements. And I believe that in the 1930s and 40s, he would be quite close to the common people. He would be very, very close to women. He would be very close to the slaves. He would sympathize with them. He would try to encourage them. He would try to see them as human beings and depict them as human beings, who have dignity, who have equality, who have self-respect, and who would like to be treated, on a par with others. So this thing, this visualization by him in his literary writing will finally make him a very sensitive writer. And because these characters that he will be picking up, these situations, that he'll be imagining, these situations are directly from Australia. So don't you think, viewers, that this kind of a depiction of the Australian life and its reality, which is not the reality of England or Western countries. This reality is finally to crystallize in what is called Australian reality, Australian identity, Australian recognition of peculiar features, and it is this which is at the back of Australian writing in general. So I thought that this kind of help will be required in order to place this novel and to place this novelist, and he is the first writer who would be awarded Nobel Prize for his writing in the 1970s, and he will be a big name then. Initially people did not take him seriously, at least in the English press, but when he got Nobel Prize and when he started getting recognition, when his books were sold in large numbers, then people took note of him. And where do I put him and his novel in the tradition of English writing and novel writing? This is the question that I face, and this is the question that you also would face if you read his novel. And it's a big novel. Voss is a very, very, very long novel. So if you read this novel, then this question will occur to you: where to place it in the tradition of English novel writing? And English novel writing has evolved from the 18th century onwards, when it is born. The novel fiction is born in the 18th century in England, and then it spreads all over Europe, and there are great novelists in the 19th century all over Europe, in fact greater sometimes than English writers in Russia and in France and later in America. So this great writing of Europe will initially be a heritage for the Australian novelist, but then Australia would carve a niche for itself in the literary world by focusing on its experiences. So Patrick White is that kind of a novelist who has learned the hard way the art of recognizing one's peculiarity and one's speciality, so that finally he is able to assert himself not as an English writer but as an Australian writer. So this is the background that I give to this, and then I give a few details about his life. Patrick White is born in 1912, as I told you, of Australian parents in England, educated in Australia till age of 13. Next phase of education in England, and he goes to interestingly to a school where soldiers are produced. In English society needed soldiers. They had to manage colonies in India, for instance. They had to manage colonies elsewhere in Australia, and for that they required soldiers. In fact, if you read 19th century literature, initially there is poverty in England. Dickens's novels in the 19th century are full of poor people, and there are beggars on the streets, and there are cheats, there are rogues, there is violence, and there is that kind of poverty, prostitution. All this thing is there in England in the 19th century, but suddenly continents like Australia are recognized as resources by the Englishmen, and then Dickens in one of the novels says that somebody would be sent or would like to go to Australia in order to become comfortable there. So in this kind of situation, you will see that there's not as much poverty in England in the second half of the 19th century, whereas all the poverty has been shifted and criminals have been shifted to other parts of the world. So these are the things that please keep in mind. So far as his novels are concerned, the first novel he writes in 1939. At that time he is 22 years old, or 27 years old. His second novel is in 1941. So he is growing up as a novelist in the 1940s. Then there is a novel called The Tree of Man. It is 1955. And see the titles. The first novel is Happy Valley. What is he thinking about? There is a happy valley somewhere. There is nature. There is nature's bounty, and people are happy there. And it's very ironical to call the world happy at that time, because it's not a world which belongs to you. It's a world that is inhabited by some other people, and you are grabbing it. You are capturing it. Then the second novel is The Living and the Dead. Naturally, living can't be defined except in relation to death. And there are people who live, and there are people who are dead, and there has to be a kind of a contrast to be seen. The Tree of Man. The Tree of Man is a slightly positive novel, in the sense that you talk about some kind of a growth, some kind of evolution, some kind of development. And in 1957, which is the 6th or 7th novel, is Voss. Voss actually is the name of a person, and the novel is built around this character, and around this person and his experiences. And in fact, it's so long a novel, and the story goes on and on with piling up of experiences of his personal kind, but his experiences are actually not personal. And that's why Voss finally in the novel, around the time of his death, he becomes Australia. If you have to understand Australia, then read this novel, then think of this character, try to understand him, and then what happens is you know that, oh, this is what Australia is. So it's that kind of a powerful novel which symbolizes the entire Australian experience and existence. Then there is a novel, just see that he's as he's writing one novel after another, then he's tackling different themes, different questions and concerns. For instance, there is a novel called The Solid Mandala. Now, what is mandal or mandala? It's a Sanskrit word. So he must have seen this word somewhere, heard this word somewhere, and he thought that this kind of a mandal could be a kind of state of mind, a state of balance, which is the philosophy, a philosophical concept that is there in India, and he might have thought of finding some solace, some kind of a peace and tranquility, some kind of a balance, in thinking about the mandal. And there are poems written by him, there are short stories, and there are plays. As I told you about his winning the award, Nobel Prize Literature, and that happened in 1973 when he was 61 years, 61 years, and he dies in 1990 at the age of 78. So it's a long life. It's a life that has seen 2 world wars, and after the Second World War, that's the time which this is the most productive for him. Of course, he starts writing in 1939 when the war begins, but then very soon the war will come to an end, 45 or so, and then it is going to be a different world. How do I say it will be a different world? I say it because after the Second World War, the world will remap itself. There will be a large number of countries which were colonies till the Second World War. They will emerge as independent countries, and even though Australia cannot be called a colony, it was a country dominated entirely by the whites, so it could not be exactly called a colony, but virtually it's a colony, because it is second to the interests of England and Europe, and the people are fighting in Europe and they are fighting in England, in Australia. That's the First World War and Second World War. All the European countries were at loggerheads with one another, and the war ended only in the mutual destruction of all, partially, economically, that is. And in the Second World War, the same thing happened. So if Germans and Englishmen are fighting in the Second World War in the 1930s and 40s, then what are they doing in Australia? There also there would be tensions. So that kind of a thing. So Australia was not exactly a steady and a good place to live in till the end of the Second World War. After that, when the economic control shifted, economic control came to an end, at least partially, and there was a kind of parliament, there was a kind of movement in Australia around the Second World War, and then people thought that they had to have their own identity and their own say in the matter. And when that happens, then Australian identity also asserts at the level of politics, at the level of society, and at the level of culture. So it is around this time that there is a flowering of literature in Australia, and in Voss sometime later, because Voss is written in 1957, this novel. By that time, and he wrote the novel close to 2 years. So which means for those 2 years he was totally immersed in writing this novel, and he was all the time engaging himself with the complex reality of Australian life in the years following the war, for the Second World War. So that way, it's I would say symbolically, it's a gold mine of human experience. This is a novel which helps us understand our own processes. This helps the reader understand one's own processes, and finally there is a conclusion, and that conclusion is realistic in nature. So, Dr. Seema, what would you say about such a novel and about such a process?
Sir, actually, it seems that it is a visual explanation of the time of those First World War and the time of Second World War, and I'm through your discussion and explanation, I was feeling that I have went to that time. I was really experiencing those agony, those sufferings of the people out there, and I was really going through the details which you told, that there must be a hard life of those the people who went to jails, who were sent to jails, I should say. And as you said that after a time European countries also rushed there for the gold, and it must be a hard life out there. And as the Patrick White was a child at that time, he must have gone through a lot of experiences which tend him to develop such writing.
Did you think of India also?
Yes, India also has gone through same thing, because we have also have struggles, and we have also had the British rule over us, and British Empire, I guess, used us, exploited us on socially, politically and economic, on every front, and they utilized each and every resource of ours, may it be manpower, may it be our natural resources.
So you would be able to relate to this novel?
Obviously I was relating. That's why I was saying that I was going through your discussion. I was just feeling that I was going through the everything which has happened in Indian period of those struggle times, which I have studied in our books or in our everything. So it was a correlating sort of thing, that every colony which fall under British Empire felt the same type of struggle as India has felt.
And I have not yet touched upon the case of women here.
Yes.
I just referred to them.
Yeah.
So when the plight of women, and when their imagination and all that is also discussed here, then I think you will be able to relate still better
Yes.
to the account in the novel.
Yes.
So viewers, with this initial discussion about the novel, which is there of the background of the Australian experience, and the kind of dilemmas that writers face, and they have to pick and choose. They have to reject the wrong and they have to pick up the right, and they have to explain and elaborate what is right for them in such a manner that it's artistic. Not that he is going to preach anything. He is only sharing his experiences as an observer, and as an observer he imaginatively identifies himself with those who are in his opinion good. So we will take up a few more points about the novel in the second part of the lecture.
Yes, sir. Dear friends, I know that this is really a good experience to go through this lecture, and you must also have some queries. You must be having some queries. If you have then please call us on our toll free number, that is 1800110430. We'll see you after a really short break. Welcome back, friends. We are going through the Australian experience in world literature, and today we are discussing the novel Voss by Patrick White. So far, you have learned that what was the time during the First World War and the Second World War. Now, in this half of this lecture, we will be talking about the novel. Let me remind you that if you have any questions regarding this session or lecture, you can call us in the last 10 minutes of this lecture, and you can call us on our toll free number, that is 1800-110-430. So, let us continue with the topic. So, please.
Welcome, viewers. Now, we will be focusing upon the novel Voss, and as I told you, Voss is the name of the hero, the protagonist of this novel, and he is an Englishman, and he has decided to go on a journey. So, it is a novel about a journey. Now, before I tell you about his journey, Voss's journey, let me tell you that there was a person in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, 70, 80 years before, even in fact 100 years before this person started writing the novel, and he was a German, and he went on a mission to explore Australia, and this person's his name, I'll tell you his name when it comes in my notes, but then this person wanted to explore Australia as a barren land, as an unknown thing, as a country that had its own mysteries, and this was very fascinating. So, there are records of his journey from one part of Australia to another, and people were fascinated by his accounts, and they became more curious to know as to what Australia was, what it contained, what kind of people it had, what culture it had, and this person, and this explorer went completely single-handed. So, which means that he faced a large number of problems in an alien land, the language of which he didn't know, the geography, topography, the places, the principles of life, he was completely not conversant with. So, that way this became a kind of a challenge for the writer of Voss, an intellectual challenge, how to take him in his imagination, how to understand his thought processes, what inspired this person, this explorer in the 19th century to go over a journey. And he creates a novel around a character called Voss, which will be doing the same thing. So, he will be funded by certain people. Journey is not easy in an alien country, and it's a very vast country. Australia is one of the biggest continents in the world, biggest landmass, one of the biggest landmasses, and if you go from one place to another, the weather changes, the conditions become different. It's very rocky, you can't raise crops very easily. It has sea, and all those things that offer a kind of challenge to human mind and to human life. So, this journey that he takes it's a long journey, and he is going alone. Now, one interesting thing about this journey is that when he is talking about it in his own home, then there is a young woman, beautiful young woman, who is also listening, and she becomes interested in the kind of thing that he is going to do, and she starts liking him as a person of imagination. He has romantic dreams in his life. He wants to pursue something new, something unknown. He wants to take challenges, and a woman would be fascinated by this kind of a person. He is not into the making money. He is not into building houses. He is not into becoming a great hero in the political world, in the social world. He wants to know, and a person who wants to know is an intellectual person. So, Voss that way has that kind of intellectual imagination, an imagination which wants to know more and more, which wants to adjust to the new realities, which means that the person is self-critical. If somebody tells oneself that he wants to know, then straight away you find out that this person is simple, he is good, and he doesn't boast about his own personal qualities, only that he wants to understand others and relate to them better. So, the woman in a way falls in love with him, and she suggests to him that he should write to her when he is there, and she also suggests that she will wait for him when he comes back. Now, the tragedy of the novel is that the person will not come back, he will die there. But then as he is going into the journey, as he is going from one place to another, he is all the time thinking about her, and her means a person who has taken place in his heart or occupied a place in his heart. So, he is looking at the world outside and he is looking at the world inside. So, the exploration becomes the exploration not merely of Australia, but it becomes the exploration of his own fascination and love for the woman. And in fact, when I attempted an article for a conference, then I discussed this topic, and I said that this novel seems more about knowing Australia as a woman, as an unknown territory. Till the 18th, 19th century, till feminism came into being, people would not take any interest in women. They would treat them as chattel, they would treat them as slaves, they would be just household things at home for use, and nobody would take any interest in a woman's imagination, a woman's mind, but writers did. And this writing that way is at two levels, at the level of knowing Australia and at the level of knowing oneself. And self knowledge is something very rich, and this is the only field in which literature particularly excels and flourishes. So, this novel has to be taken at two levels. So, the importance of Voss's character, I just present a quote to you, lies in the fact that he simply intends to explore the mystery and intensity of this strange country. The country is unknown, it is strange, it has a mystery. You see, you just do not know what it contains, and it's a dark kind of a continent, dark place, and one has to go with the light of one's mind. So, there is a kind of torchlight that one has, and that torchlight is not anything mechanical, it is the human imagination and the human mind. So, he goes to explore the mystery and intensity. Intensity is important. It does not have to be just a cold kind of interest in things, whether you have an academic interest, you are taking notes and you are writing back to other people, you are writing articles about what went on and all those things. It is not that kind of superficial interest in the country, it is a kind of deep interest in the country that when you go into it, then you become a part of it. You become so intensely related to the reality there in the place that you forget about what happened to you when you were away. So, that kind of intensity, when you are worked up, when you are excited, and that excitement is captured through the language, through the symbols that he uses. He goes to people, he does not understand them, they do not understand him, but then he is fascinated, and that creates a sense of intensity in him. White, that is the novelist, has further created a sense of complexity in the nature of the expedition. It is an expedition. He will be going from one place to another. He will take 10 days to. He might take a ship. One might later on take a horse, and finally he might walk. And your journey would be that way: 10-15 days in the ship, another month or so on the horseback, and then he is totally alone. By this time, he has had his companions, and companions went. They accepted payment, and who was paying for the expedition? Somebody was paying for the expedition. Back home, and a relative of the girl with whom he fell in love, and she was waiting for him to come back. So, he has a kind of baggage. The baggage is of the economic help that somebody is rendering, and this person, what interest should a person have to finance this kind of an expedition in the middle of the 19th century, which is captured by the writer in the 20th century? This is a question that I would like you to know. I would like you to discuss, I would like you to think about. You would see that when you go to a new country and when you take money from somebody, that person does not give you money just like that. That person wants to know more about that country. Maybe there is a finance kind of capital involved that is invested in your effort, so that when you come back, you tell me, you tell us, you tell the financiers as to what is there, so that financiers then can plan their own kind of ventures there. This is how colonialism in fact flourished in all parts of the world. Initially, it started with explorers. People came and explored America, people came and explored India, people came and explored China, and then they sent back their accounts, and on that account was built up the economic planning, the political planning of people back home. So, see the complexity here. We have a hero whom we like. We have a hero whom the woman who is in love with him also likes, and we know that both the woman and the man and the kind of compact that they have with each other, that is financed by a third person. who doesn't know about the individuality of these characters. So, your own effort, my own effort, somebody's own efforts are being financed by somebody, and this person who is financing it, this person is going to reap harvest of the experiences, of the information that one would collect. So, this is the point that in the novel, do not always read the novel for the interest of the story. Read also the novel in the interest of knowing the motives and the purposes of people who are involved in it in the background. So, Voss is a character, a great hero in front of us, but behind him are other characters, are interests of money, and of course, the emotional interest of the woman he loves. All these things are there. So, it is a complex affair, and Voss is both an individual and a type. So, why it has further created a sense of complexity in the nature of the expedition. He has presented different degrees of contrast and divisions. Contrast and divisions are there. When he launches on his own mission, then there are people who have doubts about him. Some people think that he is taking on the wrong course and he should live a steady life, there. But then there are others who are inspiring him. There is constant tension between the whites and the aborigines. When you go to a new country and you are a newcomer, and there are people who have been living there since time immemorial, for thousands of years, and human life is as old as anything else. So, they would see you as an intruder, and the intruder always suspects your motives, and rightly, because nobody goes without a plan. So, when a white person enters this world, then there will be tensions. The tensions may show, tensions may not show, but the tensions are there, and these tensions then are created by the writer with the help of his own imagination, and he puts them there. And there is a kind of uncertainty that Voss might face on the way. He might have a kind of fear, he might have a curiosity, and sometimes fear and curiosity mix. The more fearful you are, the more curious you become. That also happens. So, it is literature, and in literature you can't separate ideas from feelings. So, therefore, there will be a fear on one side, and there will also be a kind of thrill that you will get when you enter that territory. So, now the author has presented different degrees of contrast and divisions. There is a constant tension between the whites and the aborigines, the original inhabitants of Australia. Again, the division among the explorers further complicates the entire perspective of the journey. Divisions of the explorers. Some explorers would find out as to what you are getting. Others would like to stop you. The third one would like to egg you on to move forward, and they will have their different perspectives to work with. But it is through the multiple facets of experience. This is important. It is an emotional experience, it is an experience of curiosity, it is also an experience of newness, it is an experience of threats that you will face, and that threat is going to make you further strong, and that way when you come back after the expedition, you will be a changed person. This has been the theme of many novels, and in the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, people, as I already told you, Vasco da Gama and all. So, and they were not alone. They were on a big expedition, and there must be hundreds of people with them. So, all of them would go to a new place, and they would face these challenges. And Voss takes this particular motive of journey, of expedition, in order to explore a new territory. That is what the novel is. His expedition, how does it begin? First, the preparation of the journey. It might take 50 pages. He is preparing what he needs on the way, and the money that he needs, the companions that he has, he is to have. All those things are important. So, you draw up in fact a map of the place. The map is part imaginary, part real, and in that map you also have people who will help you, and you have to contact them, you have to motivate them, you have to convince them of your own value, and then they will come to you. And then they are not hired servants only, they also like you, they also agree with you, and that is the important part of the journey. So, preparation of the journey is in fact as important as the journey itself. The second is the journey on the ship Osprey. There is a ship, and there they will journey together. On the ship, it is very difficult to be with other people. Do you know why? The reason is that you are completely away from the world. which you know or you are a part of, and 20 people, 30 people, 100 people on the ship. All those people have to live with one another, and there can be tensions there. Some people might lose temper. Some others might crack jokes. A third might be cruel. There are all kinds of things that happen on the ship, and that itself is a very different and a difficult kind of territory zone that one has to be a part of. So there are tensions on the way. They progress through Rhine towers and Gildra. These are the places that they cross one after another, and every place has its own topography, has its own habitation, has its own villages, has its own streets, if there are streets, because in the forest and Australia, the old Australia, the ancient Australia didn't know streets. There were just pathways, and through them people went. And how they lived, what they ate, how they made fire, all these things are totally new to the white man, whose forefathers came from the developed West. So that
we have a caller with us.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello. Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, sir.
Hello.
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 Yes.
Yes, I want to ask question.
Yes.
Sir, I want some critical analysis of the novel Voss.
Yes. I hope you are Pawan.
Yes, sir, I am Pawan.
Yes, Pawan, I recognize your voice, and actually this is the critical analysis that I am giving, and I'll give more about it. Already I have referred to his relationship with a woman, to people who finance him, and when he is on a journey, then he's taking different stands at different points of time. And you are right that the novel should be critically analyzed, so that finally issues are settled. Fine. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Well, so yes, this is the critical analysis. That the novel is divided into different phases. The first phase is of preparation. In fact, when you talk about preparation, then in any way it's an exam time for us. You can relate very well with a person who is preparing for an expedition. In fact, what is an expedition? Expedition is the venture which is planned and which has some result at the end. That is called the expedition, and you have not done it earlier and you are doing it for the first time. So that expedition can be of any kind. If you want to become a skilled engineer, then it's very close to an expedition. You begin. Initially you talk. You make up your mind. Then you make the plan. Then you go and execute the plan stage by stage. So the good thing about this novel is that it takes expedition as a part of life. So far as he is concerned, the Voss is concerned, he has already made himself a kind of a student of life in Australia, and his area of study is the problems and the facets of culture, facets of society that are there in Australia. And when he comes back, he will be full of Australia, and the things, different parts would have already assumed a pattern in his mind, so that he can tell you then that this is what Australia is. So if in one word, if you have to describe this word, then Voss is a kind of identity that Australia assumed with the help of imagination of the writer Patrick White through the character of Voss. So this is how this novel is to be analyzed, and this novel has different parts, and each part has different sets of characters. Back home, as I said, then at one place, and finally Gildra. After that, he will leave his horse and he will start walking. And he can't carry all medicines in his bag, and he has to leave his bags behind because he has to now walk. So all that thing, and finally he is alone. And when a person is an explorer and he is alone, surrounded by a forest, and there is no light, where will he sleep? With whom will he talk? Who will cook food for him? And if he catches some disease, if he is feeling unwell, then who will help him, medically speaking? So all these things, at one level appear to be of the person, of the individual. At another level, you become lonely in the world. You are all alone in the world. In fact, when you sleep at night and there is nobody around you, then of course you know that you are totally alone, alien on this land. So this kind of a dreamy situation, which sometimes give us nightmares, that we are totally alone, left alone. It is that kind of thing that has been built up in the novel in such a manner that a very developed, evolved human being, well educated, motivated highly, goes on a mission, and gradually he is leaving and shedding all his encumbrances, all his accoutrements, all his possessions, and finally is all by himself, completely unprotected, without any assistance from anywhere. So you know that a social person becomes an individual, and a flourishing country becomes totally isolated in terms of economic embargo, this and that. So all these things are there, and you can see that this kind of a novel works at different levels. So I would now just make a few points general of a general nature, because there is limited time with me. So then when arid landscape comes, arid without any plantation, varying degrees of predicament, actually the entire novel is about predicament. It is about a problem. You just don't know which side to take, where to go, whether to come back, and why to come back, and whether you will be able to finally make it. All these things, decision making is one of the most difficult things, and this person has to take a decision at different places. Can he go forward? Should he go forward? There seems to be death lurking all the time, in that part of Australia where he doesn't know a single human being, and weather conditions are very bad. It's a very dry place. So if temperature, let's say, is touching 50, so you can imagine the kind of heat that is there, and how will this man tolerate, and how will he then tell himself that he is on the right kind of mission. So these personal problems, his dreams, his imagination, his memories back home, his entire education, all these things are finally revealed in a different kind of a pattern. So this novel Voss becomes actually the biography or the autobiography of an Australian who is caught in the middle of natural and social entanglements. So this is how I would like to define the novel. Now towards the end, I have just to raise this question of this novel as history. I'll finish there. Is it the history of Australia, and is it a historical novel? Some critics, Bruce Bennett, I believe, has talked about this particular problem, whether this is a novel about history. And all great writers want to discuss history. The best example is Shakespeare himself. He wrote, in fact, a whole series called History Plays. So why do writers engage with history, and why is this writer engaging with the history of Australia? And is he engaging with the history of Australia, or with the exploration of Australian culture alone? These are the questions that we have to face, and all questions will have their own separate arguments, and finally we will reach the conclusion that yes, it's a study of life in general, and particularly of the Australian culture and society. So let's now then, after taking up this particular aspect, and I am just keeping it open. In this lecture, you can't answer all the questions, nor should you answer all the questions. Leave something for the reader to analyze and discuss. So finally, I would say a few things about the man, Patrick White. What kind of politics, what kind of ideology did he espouse in his own time? And when I talked about Australia, when I talked about Australia captured in the novel, then I was sure that this kind of interest in human beings, this kind of interest in their culture, in their excitement, this kind of in their courage, all this shows that the man is a very tolerant person. The man is very inclusive, to use the word today. Is a very inclusive person. He wants to understand anybody whom he knows. So back home, when he's in the family, he talks one way. When he goes elsewhere, then also he wants to understand people. So I see in this novel and this novelist a kind of humanism. The person is liberal, the person is tolerant, he believes in humanity. He doesn't make a distinction between the Aborigines and the Australians. The Australians and the Europeans, all of them are human beings, and he has good or bad points to say about all of them. So I would say that this person in the novel and this person in society would be, for instance, saying things that take the society forward. I for instance came to know that when the Vietnam War was going on, he was writing this novel. Vietnam War was on. Vietnam became an independent country only in 1975, and this man gets Nobel Prize in 1977. So he was in sympathy with the Vietnam War, and he was critical of America, and that America had invaded Vietnam, and his sympathies were there. Finally, it was the politics of Australia at that time when he was writing was labor oriented, and in fact he was on the side of the Labour Party then. And when the Labour Party was ousted in the 1970s, then this person was angry, and he wrote a statement of anger against the overthrow of the Labour government by the other government. So what I am saying is that a writer is open-eyed. A writer tries to understand reality in all its facets. So if there is politics in the novel, if there is pain in the novel, if there is society, if there is experience in the novel, then you know that the writer is taking interest in all these things and wants to create a culture that is of tolerance and that is of mutuality. So with these words, I believe we can learn a lot from this novel, and viewers, when you read this novel, then you can raise these questions again and you can find your own answers. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Indeed, it was a very informational lecture. Friends, that's why it is said that travel to learn, and if you can't travel, then you must read books. I'm sure that you will be going through this novel after listening to this lecture. Friends, we at CEC are always ready with such informational lectures. So stay tuned with us. Thank you.